Hi there. Hope everyone's living their best quarantine out there in the global expanse. I'm Frank Bruce, your host, and we're here today with a special segment sponsored by Tephogram Solutions. Tephogram Solutions. We are a multi-platform integration service specializing in immersion pathways. Using convective instability algorithms, our forecasting tools allow users to see above the cloud, because sometimes it rains. I'm here today with Scott W. Schwartz, an archaeologist at the City University of New York who has just completed its dissertation on the archaeology of temperature. Today we're going to discuss this research, both its findings and implications, as well as the aesthetic and performative aspects of the dissertation as an artistic creative medium. If you'd like, you can get a much clearer idea of the aesthetics of Scott's project by visiting the website askschwartz.com, and that's ASKSCHWARTZ.com, and clicking on the dissertation link. So first off, Scott, would you like to give a little overview of your project and research?
Yeah, thanks. So archaeology of temperature is kind of raises some eyebrows sometimes. First off, I guess I specialize in the archaeology of numbers, which is itself kind of weird. Some archaeologists, specialize in ceramics or in animal bones or stone tools or in architecture, and some focus on symbols and art like cave paintings or Neolithic monuments like Stonehenge, or just the morphology and patterns on bowls and vases. So along these lines, I focus specifically on numbers as aesthetic symbols. More particularly, I'm interested in the material production of numbers and how meaning of numeric symbols is built out of different kinds of materials. I think there's a tendency to think of numbers as these kind of free-floating, just discursive phenomena, but all symbols have some level of material substrate. So even if you're just mentally perceiving like the number 33, that's going to require like the neurons in your brain and the food you eat. So my interpretation of numbers here is pretty broad as a concept. Like some people might say that like the shape triangle could be translated in some context to like our number 3. Quarantine, a very prominent topic today, can be translated as the number 40. It is the number 40 in Italian. Its original meaning is 40 days of isolation. So along these lines, I study the material construction and meaning of these numbers, like in some cases quarantine could be an object of study. It certainly is not the case that numbers have always hold the same significance socially across all populations. And
Fascinating. So why temperatures as your focus of study? Isn't archaeology generally focused on sort of older societies and their artifacts?
Yeah, right. Usually, that's what you think of. But historical and contemporary archaeology are very robust fields today. There are researchers working on the archaeology of homelessness and archaeology of migrant border crossings, and even there's some people doing archaeology of space exploration. So the idea with a lot of this work is usually to challenge the sort of normalized discursive histories or narratives through using and studying material culture. Like homelessness is often associated with this like lack of material wealth, but in the excavations of some of these homeless encampments, you see like this huge collection and spectrum of material goods and material items, but they're just kind of assembled in this way that's sort of counter-normative to general relationships of ownership and exchange. Temperatures. Sometimes it helps to give this quick little anecdote about why I think temperatures are kind of politically intriguing and not so boring, especially as like a subject of anthropological investigation. So, a couple of years ago, I was at this conference, and there's this artist, Lori Palmer was there, and I mentioned something about temperature in my talk, and afterwards she kind of told me this story about her office on the campus was really like uncomfortably hot. So she called the facilities people at the university and asked if they could come and look at it and see if they could make it less hot in her room. They sent some people over there with a thermometer, and they checked out the room, and they said, The room is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not really that hot. There's nothing more we can really do. The room, like they decided, was objectively not hot. In the work order, though, the Laurie Palmer saw this work order, and they're like detailing the resolution of like how the case was solved. The staff wrote that it was the office of this middle-aged woman, which is pretty kind of fairly easy to interpret. That they were suggesting, she's maybe experiencing hot flashes, menopausal times. So this idea that she was wrong about it being hot because she had some kind of non-normative body, according to a thermometer, that this thermometer device is the ultimate arbiter of what is hot or cold, and that like embodied experiences are untrustworthy, that she had this deviant body which couldn't be trusted to accurately assess the thermal conditions of her room. This was kind of interesting to me, and so I sort of set about investigating how this sort of disembodied knowledge production came about, or why it became sort of dominant or normalized. I think temperature does a really good job of exemplifying that. Like how did numbers that we sort of apply to the behavior of materials like mercury get more weight in organizing a society's needs than the sentiments and of the actual people? And so, bringing this around to archaeology, I was working with, I am a regular archaeologist sometimes. I do dig around in the dirt, and I was working with some environmental archaeologists studying ecological instability in medieval Iceland. But in the process of that, I got a lot more fascinated in how the paleoclimatologists today were producing archaic environments and sort of retrofitting our understanding of these environments onto archaic human behavior. Like saying something that it was 2 degrees colder in the year 1425, so those people adopted a new fishing strategy. It seemed odd that they were saying that this population from 1425 did something because it was 2 degrees colder. They didn't have thermometers, they didn't have temperature in 1425. They didn't do anything because it was 2 degrees colder. That didn't really bear on their life. It's like an anachronistic kind of notion. Like saying something like people 3,000 years ago were bad Christians. It's like, just doesn't, they probably were, but so like the idea of producing temperatures in the present to describe conditions that existed before temperature was even invented became this kind of fascinating subject for me. What is this material culture that constructs the past and the future environments? What materials are involved, and what does it mean that we do this? So yeah, a great deal of materials and devices are required to construct temperatures. There's lots of different types of thermometers, but more interesting than this, I think, to me, is the materials from which we choose to read for their thermal meanings. Like the mercury thermometer, the mercury expands when it's heated, so in that case it's the fluctuations in mercury's volume are translated into warming and cooling. But in the 18th century, by no means was mercury settled on as the material that was going to be used to translate thermal flux. Its choice by physicists has a very much a socio-economic kind of history. Other materials were tried: air, water, olive oil, alcohol, sulfuric acid. Mercury probably wouldn't have been chosen if not for its widespread use at the time in the silver mining enterprises of the Spanish in the Americas. So for over 100 years, when temperatures first getting started, they're really trying to push alcohol solutions as the material from which temperatures are sort of created. Today, most temperatures are read from fluctuations in the resistivity of metal oxides. Based on warmth, they get more resistant or less resistant. This is what all the sort of digital temperatures you see are made out of. So yeah, we've gone from like the relative volume of mercury to the relative resistivity of magnesium oxide as the primary translator of heat into a number. We turn these behaviors of these metals we rely on them to tell us how warm it is instead of our own nervous systems.
So how do they know that the temperatures? How do they know the temperature from like thousands of years ago, from 3,000 years ago?
Yeah, so you can use a lot of materials to do this. Actually, you can do tree ring records; those go back about 7,000 years, and that's just sort of based on the density and the width of the tree rings. Those correlate well with thermal fluctuations. Ice core analysis from Antarctica or Greenland can go back 800,000 years. The sediment core analysis from the deep sea, that can go back millions of years. Ice cores have this, similar annual kind of patterning, like the same way, tree rings do. But if you get like 3,000 meters deep in an ice core, what that really is it's a record of precipitation going back 800,000 years. And you can read these ice cores for their chemical content using a mass spectrometer. And basically you just sort of discern the ratio of oxygen 16 to oxygen 18 isotopes. And in warmer years, if there's a greater ratio of oxygen 18 because less H2O has condensed in the clouds and rained out as the clouds journey towards the poles.
Okay, so you're sort of like toggling between different metrics or systems of measurement.
That's right.
Yeah. What's an isotope again?
So all elements have protons and neutrons in their nucleus there, and basically like how many protons determine what an element is. So if there's like 3 protons, it's lithium. If there's 1, it's hydrogen. But there can be like weirdly like a range of different neutrons for different elements. So most oxygen in the universe has 8 neutrons in its nucleus, but about 1% of the universe's oxygen has 10 neutrons in it. And these different kinds of oxygen are just basically called isotopes. As you might imagine, like the oxygen with 10 neutrons is heavier. It's got 2 more neutrons. And it's pretty straightforward. As you might imagine, that heavier oxygen with the 10 neutrons will rain out of clouds first, because it'll fall first. And the same with evaporation. The lighter oxygen will evaporate first because it's lighter. Like it will get into the air faster than the heavier oxygen. And so clouds generally they move towards the poles. If there's been more rainfall in a year, that means it was colder, and by the time that oxygen that's in those H2O in the clouds gets to the poles, it tells you information about how warm it was.
Okay, wow. All right. So I mean, temperatures definitely seem a bit more dense as a artifact and certainly a bit more interesting than we often think as we go about our daily lives. But how do you really go about doing an archaeology of this? Like, what does that mean in this context?
Yeah, right. So again, temperatures do have this, they're so background and normalized, and they're so ubiquitous. You probably look at temperatures every day. Sometimes you look at temperatures of the present moment, and sometimes you look at temperatures for tomorrow or the next day or a couple hours in the future. You might look at temperatures from 50 years in the future if you're looking at a report on climate change or from the past. You see temperatures on billboards, bus stops, they're everywhere. So my work tries to get at how and why so many temperatures are produced. Now, it might seem like self-evident, right? Or might seem like a silly question. But, why is it that, there is a digital temperature next to a giant billboard of a Calvin Klein supermodel ad? Why do old dive bars maybe have an old thermometer hanging up behind the bar? And IBM's meteorology branch produces 30 billion temperatures per day.
Jeez.
And there's these researchers at Stanford who have created this temperature that's a thousandth of a fraction above absolute zero, like using lasers, as much as I know. NASA's spent, billions and billions of dollars launching satellites to measure the temperature of the cosmic microwave background. When, it's really great that they have these satellites that confirmed, the temperature of the cosmic microwave background, but they had already kind of figured it out with pen and paper from here on Earth. They were right, luckily. There's been like lawsuits over certain temperatures. So, there's these, just kind of asking these questions about how and why there's so many temperatures being produced is interesting, because it really takes away from that like self-evident to nature aspect of temperatures. It's not like temperatures were invented or are created to just tell you how hot it is, or if you should wear a jacket or not. What I do is actually just investigate these specific temperatures and try to learn from their material construction what social functions and roles they're serving, by looking at how the meaning is produced through the material interactions. I think it gives insights into what a population really values in its knowledge production. We generally kind of have a pretty good idea of what 72 degrees means. There's not a lot of mystery in that. But there is something funny about how much material and labor and fuel is brought together to create these numbers. And I want to know what it means that we do this. What does it say about, a people, a society that exerts so much effort to surround itself in numbers?
Okay. So could you just tell us, you said that there's a lawsuit over temperatures. Could you just give me like sort of one anecdote about like one of these sort of strange temperatures?
Right. Well, that one in particular is interesting. I don't know, for the listeners in New York, there's a ice cream shop in Williamsburg. It's called negative 321 degrees ice cream shop. So negative 321 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which nitrogen, I think, becomes, it condenses from a gas, or it freezes. It's the point at which nitrogen freezes, which is negative 321 Fahrenheit's, pretty cold. It's a gas at room temperature. The ice cream shop uses this kind of like frozen nitrogen technology. And, they can they have their creamer and they whip it up and they put the flavors in there. And, then they blast it with this nitrogen frozen. Or maybe, I think that, the difference, they blast it with the cold nitrogen and you got ice cream right then. But there was another restaurant that opened up in Manhattan called negative 321 degree. It was called Lab negative 321, and it was also a restaurant that incorporated this kind of cold nitrogen cooking process into its recipes. And the ice cream shop sued or sent a letter of cease and desist to the Lab 321, and it's pretty funny. So the Lab 321 did stop. They changed their name to Lab 320. Because honestly, the actual freezing point or the when it condenses is it's negative 320.6 or something. So it's really not that big a deal. That's
okay. Wild, right? So temperatures are running hot.
That's right.
Or cold.
Very ice cold.
All right, so you say temperature wasn't invented for us to know how hot it is. It's not intended to tell us whether we should wear a jacket or not, of course. Okay, so from your research, can you tell us a little bit about why you're hypothesizing it was invented?
Different temperatures are invented for different reasons, and different types of temperature used for different reasons. But probably, I guess, the most broadly accurate answer is that temperatures make great data, and quantified data has taken on quite a bit of political and economic and social significance over the past 500 years. It's not just like, in the past 20 years with big data that there's been this prioritization of quantified data as the basis for good knowledge, and and subsequent to that, like governing decisions. People had been making like thermal observations using instruments, like you wouldn't call them thermometers. They were actually called thermoscopes, which is a pretty good word. They were doing this all the way back. The classical Greeks had invented these thermoscopes, which basically work almost exactly the same as a thermometer, except they don't have numbers. They don't use mercury. They use air and water. As it gets hotter outside, the air expands and pushes water down, and so the water level on one day or the next is going to be higher or lower. But they didn't have numbers. But you could, if you went outside and you saw the thermoscope's water was at a higher level, you'd know it was hotter. So you could know on a day-to-day basis if it was hotter, but you couldn't record this data. So beginning in the 1600s, they did start putting numbers on these things. And from that, once you have this sort of standardized quantification system, that's when you start, that's when temperature is invented. That's when you start calling it temperature. You go into a lot about why, sort of in Western Europe, there was this valuation of quantities in this time period. Generally you might hear a story about how the advocates for numeracy argued that numbers were more objective. It's interesting though, if you look at what a lot of these scholars at the time are really saying, like your Francis Bacon and your Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and these guys, the words they're using, they're really championing numbers because they're amoral and they're indifferent. Unlike humans who have morals and do care about things. This was seen as a good thing among these scholars, that you wanted knowledge that did not have any sort of morals or did not care. Another reason why quantified data began to gain importance from the 17th century on is the invention of probability and the math of probability. This is invented in the 1600s and developed in the 1600s. Probabilistic calculations, require quantified data to be completed. So transforming the world into quantified data became pretty lucrative, especially considering this is also when insurance and finance and to some extent banking industries are really kind of latching onto this probabilistic method of making decisions. This is, I think, why temperature is invented. People are making thermal observations for thousands and thousands of years, for some out of curiosity, and certainly, obviously metallurgy, which has been practiced for, 8,000 years or more, you needed to have really precise control of the heat. You have to have fires over 2,000 degrees to make iron. So people were able to control heats to that extent, for
ages and ages.
But temperature itself, it didn't really help us necessarily. But the ability to control heat wasn't lacking prior to the invention of temperature. The thermometer, it's much better at being data than it is at being necessarily. It's a fairly arbitrary gauge of heat. It's no better or worse than your body. Your body has evolved for 4 million years to have very finely tuned perception of thermal fluctuations. You're sweating or your goosebumps. These are indications of thermal activity. These are measures of thermal activity. And they can even detect things that thermometers can't. Like, I mean, when you maybe start to sweat and it's not hot out, it's maybe you're nervous or something. What's happening there is the particles in your body are moving faster, which is by definition getting warmer. But that's not necessarily something a thermometer can even detect. But these bodily sensations, they don't make good quantitative data.
Yeah. Okay. So certainly temperatures have this deeply embedded political and economic history. And you could almost say that this is sort of like a way to delegitimize human subjectivity insofar as it's sort of like displacing, like if you say a number is amoral, then you don't kind of have to take that kind of responsibility.
Yeah, right. I think that deferral of responsibility and is a big part of this turn towards basing decisions and governance on quantified data. That sort of perceived amorality of numbers, it was definitely seen as a virtue over written sentiments and words. I mean, it was seen as more reliable than words, basically, which would always carry the sort of personality or character of the writer or the speaker. And for some reason, they thought numbers didn't do that. That numbers, the production of numbers, was somehow detached the producer from them. There's the numbers don't lie. It's kind of the you probably heard that before. I don't know if they're right about that. I mean, you can certainly manipulate numbers just as easily as you can words. But yeah, the idea was sort of, at least among some of these early scholars, that no morals was better than the potential for some level of immoral human bias. So yeah, moral knowledge came to be seen as not very good knowledge. Like the quality of it it wasn't considered quality knowledge if it had any morals to it. Mm-hmm. Among the elite scholars, this point of view is not widely accepted even until the mid 1800s. In the 1800s, they're still questioning this reliance on quantification. At least the common folk.
Yeah. I can, from what I've read of those scholars, there is this major kind of turning away from language and distrust and mistrust of it. So what is the precise definition of temperature today?
Yeah, this is a great question too, because temperature was invented 200 years before it was defined. They're going around, they have these thermoscopes, they put numbers on it, and they have numbers that go along with their with the fluctuations in heat, which it's really satisfies curiosity, and they can kind of have a standard here, but they don't know what it means really. It's not really connected to any kind of physical process. So yeah, old Daniel Fahrenheit, a real person, what temperature was to Daniel Fahrenheit is not the same thing that it was to Stephen Hawking or somebody. Fahrenheit has his scale in 1724, and old Anders Celsius gets his in by 1742, and these are good scales that are tied to physical phenomena, like the phases of ice, but still they don't really have any firm definition in terms of physics. So temperature didn't really get its current definition until the 1850s. Today, the definition of temperature is the average kinetic energy of particles of a substance. That could be air, it could be water. So if you break that down a little bit, kinetic energy is really just it's the relationship between mass and velocity. It's 1/2 of mass times velocity squared. That is what kinetic energy is. It's just this quantified relationship. So temperature, it's really just a function of velocity, because all the particles have very little mass. But they're capable of wildly varying velocities. So when something is warmer, it's just because particles are moving faster. Absolute zero temperature, which doesn't really exist, or can't exist, is absolute zero motion. The hottest temperatures are just, which is about 5 trillion degrees Celsius, you see them at the CERN super collider, where they're spinning those particles around at like 99% the speed of light. But the average part of this definition too is kind of funny, that it's the average kinetic energy is the definition. So an average is always an idealization. It's not an observed iteration of any specific instance of a phenomenon. Like the average person doesn't really exist. You just take a lot of properties that a human could have and create some kind of statistical ideal of regularly occurring properties, and on a smaller scale and maybe with less properties, at least from our perspective, there's not an average H2O molecule. So when we measure a temperature, we're getting the idealized velocity of a substance's particles. And it's just that scientists have just conceded that it's impossible to know the exact velocity of every particle. It's beyond us. If you can't know the exact velocity of every H2O molecule in boiling water. Mm-hmm. They're not all moving exactly the same velocity. They're trying to move at the same velocity, but at any given moment they're not. But the velocities are all distributed regularly. It's kind of like a bell curve, but different. But it's not centered like a bell curve. For temperature, this distribution is the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, and this was developed in the late 19th century. And this is like when temperature got its definition that we use today. It's just temperature is this sort of distributed probability of the velocity of particles. I mentioned probability before. It's just funny that the origin of probability is as a substitute for things that are really happening. Like you do a probability calculation to learn about things that haven't happened yet, or couldn't have happened, or didn't happen. So you could calculate the probability of something happening instead of actually waiting for it to happen or actually doing it. Like you can roll dice 1,000 times to see how many times you get a 7, or you could just do it, instead of doing that, rolling the dice 1,000 times, you can do a probability calculation now, which you couldn't do before the 1600s. But now, probability is sort of used as an explanation for how reality works. It went from being a substitute for reality to an explanation for reality, which is another sort of funny artifact of 19th century science.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you have any insight into sort of how or why this definition was arrived at?
Yeah. You'd think why is it necessary to do this? Yeah. There's a really quick answer for that. Just because of the steam engine. Yeah, in the 19th century, the overriding concern was with how to elicit work from heat. That's why heat that was the most important feature of heat, was how to get work out of it. And so, the focus because of these sort of socioeconomic circumstances, the focus of physics was on exploiting this relationship between heat and work. Heat was important because it could make things move, increasingly heavy things move faster and faster. So all the main insights in thermodynamics came from studying the steam engine. And this is sort of how we, actually arrived at our whole concept of what we call energy today. The steam engine invented energy. It wouldn't be called energy if it didn't come from the steam engine. If the concept that we use the word energy for was developed through studies of water mills or windmills, we'd use a different word like flow or something like that instead of energy. You would have the first law of hydrodynamics instead of thermodynamics.
So people might say I'm running out of flow instead of I'm running out of energy.
Yeah. That's kind of the alternate history we could be living in. The first law of thermodynamics that we have today, like that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and the second law of thermodynamics, the particles tend toward behaving in velocity equilibrium over time, are direct, studies of the steam engine. And what was being studied with the steam engine was gas molecules, like the steam of H2O, as opposed to studies of liquid molecules. And gas particles are said to behave to these sort of probabilistic distributions. So that's why temperature is a probability, because we can't precisely know the velocity of individual boiled water molecules. Although we know that they try to behave in equilibrium. If given enough time, they will all be at the same temperature, or at the same velocity.
So the second law of thermodynamics, that's the one about the increase of entropy. Is that
for sure. Yeah. You go down a wormhole of diving into the history of this and the different definitions and what people say. Entropy is just... There's a lot of disagreement about what it actually is. It seems like, they should have had this figured out, but maybe the best way to put it, it's like a measure of organization. And so the basic idea is that disorganization increases with time. What's really going on behind that second law is that discernible conglomerates of particles, that could be you, that could be a chair, that could be, just a clump of particles behaving in a similar way in space somewhere. Eventually they will become indiscernible from their surrounding spaces and particles. They'll become disorganized. That organized you and the organized me will eventually become disorganized because of the compulsion of particles to move at the same velocity as their neighboring particles.
What makes them compelled to move towards this similar velocity?
That's the question. No one knows. At this point, that's the bottom of the knowledge. They just stop and say, all right, that's a law.
It's just turtles all the way down.
That's right. That's the last turtle. We don't know why that happens. That's just the law. There's that tendency for them to do that. There's nothing underneath it that says why that's happening.
A law with nothing underneath. There you have it.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating when you endeavor to get to the bottom of something and you reach the bottom and it's not satisfying. Yeah, I don't know. Another way to think about it is things blurring over time, which is maybe a little bit more relatable to our experience of how things work over time. Memories blur over time, distinctions get blurry over time. That's not such an alien concept. That's why coffee gets cold, because it's trying to attain equilibrium with its surrounding particles. A pretty vivid example is if you get a scar or something from a burn. If you accidentally spill boiling water on your hand, what's going on there is the particles inside your body are immediately trying to attain the same velocity as the boiling water that hits your skin. And the difference between those is so great, and the pressure difference is so great, and the velocity difference is so great, that the particles inside your skin burst out of your skin they're trying to move so fast to catch up with to attain velocity with the boiling water, and that's what the scar is, or maybe a welt if it gets red there. It doesn't always burst the skin, obviously. So eventually, given enough time, there won't really be any difference between your body and what surrounds your body.
Amazing. Okay. Terrifying. So now you're saying that these laws of thermodynamics needed temperatures in order to be derived.
Yeah. So heat needed to have a number associated with it for thermodynamics to plug into these equations that made thermodynamics work in the studies of the steam engine. They didn't need necessarily temperature to invent a steam engine, but they needed heat to have a number to complete the equations that understood the steam engine actually. Temperature was just kind of happily satisfying curiosity for the aristocratic savants for 100 years, and then it became sort of this standardized data, and then it became a probability that was sort of co-opted into really the formulation of energy itself.
So more or less, you could sort of say that these bedrock laws of thermodynamics, these things we learned in high school, are derived to enhance industrial output, to improve the steam engine.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine that something else would come along. Maybe it wouldn't have been temperature, but yeah, if you kind of look at the history of European science, it really tracks right on top of the dominant modes of production. In the 1700s, the physics was focused on hydrodynamics, when the primary mode of production was water mills. As steam engines began replacing water mills, the physics moved to thermodynamics. So it's like the physics is following industry and production and commerce and economy, at least over the past 300 years or so.
Okay, right. So you could really say that we've kind of derived these basic understandings of our universe from the steam engine, which is, I'm sure it's a very nice machine and all to its friends, but the steam engine is sort of invented by humans, right? And in particular, it's invented by humans to, and I don't want to be crass here or anything, but to make money.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, the steam engine is invented to sort of more rapidly transform the planet's resources into commodities, and to move those commodities around the planet at great speeds. Yeah.
Is that weird that we base our understanding of the universe on how a machine designed to accelerate the growth of wealth works, or is that just...
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, these concepts like energy and then the laws of thermodynamics are usually considered laws of nature. Often, a lot of people don't like that word nature these days in PhD school. But by no means is a steam engine a naturally occurring thing. By most definitions of natural, it's it's specifically designed, and I think for the purpose of making heat into work by people who wanted to exploit that relationship to make money. So yeah, despite being like this just kind of economic device that's launched these past 2 centuries of exponential economic growth, that was created by a specific, European society that prioritized that growth of wealth. The functioning of the steam engine has just been sort of normalized as an explanation of how the universe works. We came to understand the universe through these artificial conditions of the pumping of pistons in an engine. It's like if we decided that the way like cells work in biology was according to the behavior of microscopes or something.
But of course microscopes aren't really tools of capitalist production and the alienation of labor, or not primarily, I guess.
I think that's a fair point.
So anyway, energy. This concept is pretty much like underwriting how we think of everything, and we use it in so many contexts. And this is like sort of fundamentally developed to aid early capitalism.
I mean, I don't think a lot of people always make that connection. I think people certainly make that connection that the steam engine is an early tool of capitalist production, but the idea that energy was invented by the steam engine. I mean, I'm not saying that energy is not something that what we call energy is like the relationship between mass and velocity is. There's always been a relationship between those. It's not like that was invented in the 19th century. But framing energy as this thing that makes things happen, if it's, makes cars move or makes you want to wake up or fall asleep, at least that vocabulary came into existence in the 19th century. I think it's a kind of important distinction too, because capitalism is not powered by fuel. It's powered by energy. Doesn't run on. It's important that it couldn't have run on like flow, like if the hydrodynamics had won out. Energy is this immaterial relationship. I know we use the words like consuming energy, but it's important to keep in mind that like coal isn't energy. It's just a chunk of dead organic matter. It's fuel, and there's a finite amount of it, but there's not a finite amount of the relationship between mass and velocity. So if our sort of economic system is powered on this immaterial, non-finite concept, you can sort of see how it might be a sort of prerequisite for an economic system that demands perpetual economic growth, or perpetually accelerating economic growth. Yeah, so no, I think it's not a connection that's often made, that I don't think there could be today, 21st century capitalism unless the concept energy had come around, as is formulated as we know it today.
Yeah, so energy is a conceptual platform that enables capitalism. It's sort of a way of imagining the universe. You could say that when we speak of energy, we are reinforcing the belief in capitalism. And temperature is...
Yeah. Well, yeah, just like thinking about that sort of original anecdote about Laurie Palmer, temperature certainly disembodies heat and subsequently disempowers people, I think, by subjugating them to the authority of numbers.
I think you can certainly extrapolate some of this thermodynamic history to think about algorithmic governance today and like big data collection. It seems to me like it sort of suggests that some of the conceptual framework for this form of politics and economics and governance was laid down with the invention of temperature. Is that accurate, would you say?
I think so, yeah, to some extent for sure. I mean, there might be the case if it weren't for quantifying thermal flux, there might have been another thing that was quantified that might have served the same purpose, but yeah. And temperature's still very much doing this today. I talked about, IBM's meteorology. They have a meteorology AI program, and it does produce 30 billion forecasts a day about. Well, IBM, they're the biggest company in weather, in commercial weather, by far. Like, at least in America, they almost have a monopoly on the production of forecasts. Very notable exception with AccuWeather, which has its own stories. But yeah, IBM owns the Weather Channel and Weather Underground. And but one of the things that I've kind of learned is the Weather Company, as they're called. It's part of IBM's consumer AI branch. And so IBM's acquisition of all these meteorology companies, it's just not some kind of like just regular diversification a big company does. They're really using climatological data to improve their artificial intelligence. Yeah, I mean, temperatures are great data. Like I said, as are, of course, wind speeds and barometric pressures and all these things. There's tons of data in climatology. Modeling weather and climate are like some of the most complex computational problems there are. That's why we're not so great at it. For IBM, it really seems like their weather is more or less just kind of practice for their AI technology. I mean, they sell it. They offer targeted forecasts for Walmart and Delta Airlines and all kinds of shipping companies. Yeah, IBM, of course, they gave us the Jeopardy-winning, chess-winning AI things, Watson and Deep Blue. Their meteorology one is called Deep Thunder. It's pretty cool. People often think of like Google or Amazon as these big cutting-edge AI entities, but regular old IBM is kind of like leading the way in terms of actually integrating AI into the infrastructural world, using their AI to sort of maximize supply chain lines for Walmart from Central American farmers to their store shelves. IBM is actually doing more, I think, to materially put AI into our lives than Google and
Interesting. Well, it's illuminating to see how all these little infrastructural realities contribute overall to the disempowerment and the disenfranchisement and disenchantment of the world. Have there been any efforts to challenge this temperature-governed regime of reality, to your knowledge? Is there anything our listeners could do to combat the unwanted effects of temperature in their daily lives? I know, for one, I am intrigued by the prospect.
Yeah, I mean, that's always, it kind of leaves you makes you a little mad at temperature. I mean, you could certainly, do some experiments with maybe some non-quantitative thermal observations and thermal measurements, I guess. Yeah.
In thinking about how weather is assessed, well, we're probably more used to seeing it discussed by meteorologists or climate scientists. Weather plays a huge role in lots of works of poetry and art.
Yeah, for sure. There's all sorts of obviously thick descriptions of climatological conditions. Yeah, I've thought like, why couldn't there be, like there's movie critics and wine critics. Can we have weather critics? Can we have you'll have your weather scientists, sure, still too. But why can't, wine criticism can be really pretentious, or movie criticism, and you might not always agree with it. I read lots of movie reviews I don't always agree with, but rather than would it serve any benefit to have sort of a prosaic kind of, forecast of or a critique of the weather? The sun was eager and robust today, and with traces of lament, and the wind will firmly crest the plains, or something like that.
Yeah, sort of like the climatological or pathological surrealism.
Yeah.
This is also this is sort of reminiscent for me. I was just reading about this stuff of the weather notebooks of Henry Darger or Darger. I don't know exactly how you say it. Either way, he was very much interested in personalizing his experience of weather, and he wrote this decade-long chronicle of the weather in 6 volumes, attributing such personifications to the movements of climate. If someone tells you it's 88 degrees Fahrenheit with 20-mile-per-hour wind gusts, you could say, for instance, no, a ventral wind is carrying on from inland, warming over the sands. I think this anti-temperature or anti-meteorology could be really liberating. But has your work drawn any critique from environmentalist circles that maybe view your critiques of temperature as aiding climate change denial arguments? I could imagine this eventuality.
Yeah, and certainly, there's a lot of, given our current state of the affairs today, there's been marches for science, and some of what I say seems like it's pretty critical of the history of science and science's entwined history with capitalism anyway. Certainly it's raised some eyebrows, and it's obviously something I've thought about or concerned myself with. But my take is that things like climate change isn't caused by people denying it. It's caused more or less, we're learning, by the perpetual pursuit of economic growth. It's caused by the sort of past 200 years of global colonial order that sort of sees the planet and its resources as just extractable for the purposes of growing wealth, caused by the sort of view of nature as something to dominate or control. These are the causes of climate change, and to some extent, temperature is implicated in this. Just like, a lot of sort of academic disciplines are, but just thermodynamics, if nothing else, just via the steam engine, is without question, a body of knowledge that's very existence has contributed greatly to climate change. There would not, you could look at geology, you could look at physics, you could look at biology to some extent too, as academic disciplines. You wouldn't be extracting offshore oil rigs, if it weren't for the, amazing insights of geologists. This isn't to say, of course, that we should be ignorant of these, the relationship between heat and work and rocks and what they can do for us, but viewing the ability to do work as the main attribute of heat, I think has been detrimental. Heat can do other things. It has effects on people's moods, it can change chemical composition. Beginning of the 19th century, heat became sort of primarily how it can make commodities better has been the focus. Hydrodynamics didn't have a number like temperature. that would allow that could even allow like the equations of fluid dynamics to be completed. Even to this day, it doesn't. So yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I don't want to like give any fuel to climate change deniers, but at the same time, climate change denial is not why there's climate change. It's not why there's global warming. So I think my defense is to sort of say that I'm attacking the problem more at its root but I guess there comes with some dangers.
Perhaps one way, stop me, but perhaps one way to break the twin crises of climate and inequality is through breaking temperature's hold. I mean, I'm imagining this counterfactual world of flow.
Yeah.
But breaking temperature's hold, this would need to be some sort of an effort from...
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know if you can organize like a political movement around it. I mean, getting up some kind of like thermalist cult or something, you can kind of advocate for the liberation of, thermal sensations from the oppression of temperature. I don't know, it might have some legs.
Yeah. I'm with you. I think some sort of Mithrian counter religion would certainly be effective. Something to sort of liberate thermal flux from the dominion of temperature. This sort of stranglehold stretching back through our, as long as our recent socio-political history can be distinguished. Would you, Scott Schwartz, be willing to make a founding statement here on the air, something like a manifesto?
I'm into it. For too long, we the people of the future labored in the vice grip of our numeracies. For too long have we taken temperatures. For too long have we been given temperatures and accepted them. Our hands outstretched, a poisoned gift. Abandon thermometry, cast off the scales, for these are the cruel devices of an order which bestokes its own destruction. Come out into the sun, a sun which is not a number, a sun which cannot be quantified.
That's just the beginning, of course. Well, I for one have shivers loquaciously seeping from my epicenters. If any of our listeners would like to call in to describe a transient thermal state they're currently experiencing, or offer color commentary on the historic event which has just occurred, I refer of course, to the founding of a new cult. Our phone lines are open.